Tonight, the European Parliament attempts to lay down the law on the hours we should work. Why have the Labour representatives there voted for a measure the Labour government here says is unjustified, and they vowed to stop? At Westminster, the Prime Minister soothes his backbenchers, but how secure is his authority? We'll talk to the new Leader of the House of Commons. He's President Bush's choice for the United Nations, but could John Bolton be too controversial a choice for the US Congress?
You said that if the Security Council were made today, that you would have only one permanent member, the United States.
And she's been called Osama bin Laden's worst nightmare. Could this woman's ideas transform Islam?
Through our screaming self-pity and our conspicuous silences, we Muslims are conspiring against ourselves.
Good evening. Devout believers in the European project have been irritated for years at the fact of British exceptions to European regulations. Today, the European Parliament voted that this country should no longer have an opt-out from the directive which limits the working week to 48 hours. The Labour government here says it's vital to the national economy that the opt-out remains, but among those voting to end it were the British Labour representatives in the European Parliament. To set the scene, here's Paul Mason.
Managers do it to enhance their careers. Manual workers do it to make ends meet. Men, if you believe the sociologists, do it to avoid the washing up. 1 in 7 British workers works more than 48 hours a week. But today, time ran out for Britain's long hours culture.
355 in favour, 272 against, 31 abstentions. Adopted.
That translates as 1-0 to the social Europe, and it provoked a rare frisson on the floor of the European Parliament.
The range of coalition was from the left to the Liberals and also to the centre and centre-right, that means the European People's Party. And the argument has been that we want to have a common Europe which is not competing against each other, but is competitive in a global surrounding, because we cannot lower our wages and we cannot make our working time higher and higher, because that would be a self-exploitation and that would deteriorate the quality of our work.
In the 2002 Labour Force survey, just under 4 million workers said they were working more than 48 hours a week. 1.1 million were managers, of which 940,000 were, you guessed it, men. Another 1.1 million were professional and technical staff. 500,000 were skilled trades, all but 10,000 of them male. And the best part of the rest were factory workers, unskilled workers and secretaries. In industries like construction, long hours are a way of life, and that's only possible because of Britain's opt-out from the 48-hour limit. The unions have been pushing hard to get it scrapped.
People normally work between 45 and 50 hours a week, many working longer than that. For instance, on the CTRL at King's Cross, the contractual hours for construction workers there are 49 and a half hours. Now, we believe that people work with heavy equipment, heavy plant, working at heights, working down holes. You've got to be alert, and if you're working these sort of hours, then surely, but common sense will tell you that you cannot be as alert as you would need to be.
But for employers, today's decision is the opposite of common sense. 85% of bosses in the construction industry said removing the opt-out would make their companies harder to manage.
They're very disappointed. They were hoping that we would keep the opt-out. With the government's help, we still can. So the Council of Ministers has the final say. But our members need that flexibility. And many of them were looking to the European Parliament to set the lead, to actually say the tide of regulation is stopping. We're going to begin to increase labour flexibility, not restrict it, that will enable us to compete with the economies such as China and India.
The original rationale behind the 48-hour limit was health and safety. But, like Europe itself, the justifications have expanded. Getting more women into the workforce is a key target for the EU. Only a legal limit on hours will open up the all-male heavy industries, say its supporters. And then there's the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is now part of the proposed Euro Constitution. It says, every worker has the right to limitation of maximum working hours. The political terrain in Europe has shifted from centre-left to centre-right, and that's eroding the whole rationale for British opt-outs. The argument is, if there is going to be a bare minimum of regulation, then everybody should sign up. On top of that, there's the constitution debate. In France and the Netherlands, opponents of the constitution say it's too Anglo-Saxon, too Blairite. So it's no accident that most of those jumping for joy at Britain's defeat today were in the pro-constitution camp. So it's not really about how much overtime 1 or 2 million manual workers do, it's about where Europe's going.
Working longer hours isn't really the topic that we're talking about. Many companies don't work such long hours. What we're talking about is the flexibility to work those longer hours if you need it on certain occasions, and that's what we're trying to preserve.
Britain should be able to turn things round at the next Council of Ministers, but that's not certain. The only certain thing is that British MPs will never get to vote on it.
Well, our political editor, Martha Carney, is here now. What's the government making of all of this, Martha?
Well, they certainly regard it as bad news. I was talking to someone in Downing Street this evening who was saying that when you get headlines on the 6 o'clock news like stripped of our right to choose, it's exactly what they don't want. They think it plays very badly into the broader arguments about Europe. But they certainly agree with the kind of thing that Paul was talking about there, that's saying that this is reflective of a much wider debate in Europe between what they would say was, old Europe, the countries that originally founded the European Union, and new Europe, the Eastern European countries, between the social Europe and the Anglo-Saxon model that Paul was describing there, the ideas of labour market deregulation. Now, they say that the 48-hour directive comes from an earlier era. It was from the time of Jacques Delors, and it's certainly not one that the modern Commission is in any way keen on. And they also think that although the vote was lost in the European Parliament today, they've been doing a lot of lobbying of some of the newer countries, some of the Eastern European countries, and they're confident when the member states vote in the Council of Europe that they will be able to win the day.
Because Europe really didn't play as much of an issue in the election campaign.
No, not at all. It was the dog that didn't bark. Or, I mean, in a way, it was almost like a conspiracy of silence. All the main parties had reasons why they didn't want to talk about it. For the Conservatives, they'd had their fingers burnt badly in 2001 with the William Hague's Scrap the Pound campaign was seen to have failed. For the Liberal Democrats...
Pound, his campaign was, wasn't it? One day to save the pound.
Save the pound, exactly. Save the pound, exactly. So, and for the Liberal Democrats, they didn't want to appear too Europhile when they were fighting Conservative seats. And the Labour Party had kicked it into touch, as it were, by deciding that they were going to hold a referendum. Now, in terms of the referendum, at the moment, the mood after quite a bruising election campaign, people are saying that they're pretty daunted by the prospect. And I suppose the worry for them must be that there'll be like an enormous by-election effect. They're prepared to let Labour win the election. When it comes to a referendum, it'll actually be a referendum on Blair. Now, the tactics we're going to see the Yes campaign employ, very similar to what they did during the election campaign, which is to make sure that Blair is surrounded by as many other people as possible. So certainly Gordon Brown, who they think will want to, throw his energy into winning the campaign, and also people outside the party like the CBI to try and say that there is a broad coalition in favour of the national interest.
Thank you, Martha. Well, a little earlier I spoke to Jerry Sutcliffe, Minister at the newly named Department for Productivity, Energy and Industry, and asked him what sort of example this row set for Britain's upcoming presidency of the EU.
I think it shows that we're serious about trying to create jobs in the European Union. We want to see flexibility, we want to make sure that people are treated fairly. The opt-out to us has been very important to maintain that labour market flexibility.
Why don't your Euro MPs understand that then?
It's very difficult in terms of the unemployment levels in other member states for them to understand why the opt-out helps.
But why don't your own Euro MPs understand that?
Well, that's because of the complex voting systems there is in the European Parliament. They're part of the Socialist Group. The Socialist Group had a 3-line whip on.
What, they're sheep, are they?
They have to vote in concordance with the Socialist Group in the European Parliament to get other things through.
Well, hang on. Your manifesto says you're working hard with Labour MEPs determined to remain leaders in Europe.
We certainly are, and we'll be looking to continue to work with those.
They've just voted against what you want.
Well, they've decided that we all want to do the same thing. We all want to create jobs.
Want to do different things.
We all want to create jobs in the European Union, and how we do that, and we're very good at doing that in the UK because we have the highest level of employment than any other member state. But a key part of that...
Why don't your Euro MPs understand that?
Well, I think that they do understand that.
But they voted against what you want.
Jeremy, the situation is that the Working Time Directive is a key part of our employment legislation.
Just asking you why your Euro MPs don't understand that.
I think they do understand, but you'll have to ask them why they voted in the way that they did. We are very clear what the government's position is. We're very clear about what we want to achieve. Well, they should be. I've spoken to them on many occasions, but I say that's a question that you have to ask them.
Why have they failed to act upon what you've told them?
Because you would have to ask them why they voted in the way that they have. It's part of the European voting system, but we're very clear that we want to make sure that we create jobs in the European Union. That's what Europe is about, making sure that the Lisbon agenda is achieved, and in the UK we're heading towards that, and we've been able to do that by keeping people in work.
Well, I put it to you, Mr Sutcliffe, that this is yet another example of your failure to influence what happens in Europe.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I think if you look at the issues today, the Working Time Directive
You can't even get your own MPs to vote how you want.
We've got a situation where the European Parliament has decided that it feels that the opt-out has to be removed.
These are your representatives in the European Parliament.
Well, we're in a situation where this is a co-determination through the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers. At the Council of Ministers, we will make sure that our arguments are put.
So,
our MEPs...
I'm sorry, did these people have their brains removed when they went to Strasbourg?
The European Parliament operates in the way that it does. It's a very complicated procedure, and I'm sure you'll be asking them why they're voting in the way that they did.
Do you understand why they voted as they did?
Because they're part of the Socialist group, and the Socialist group have voted in the way that they have because of the issues across Europe, which we're trying to all achieve, which is to make more employment in the European Union. We in the UK are achieving that, and by doing that we're creating employment, and we're trying to make sure that people are treated fairly.
But you will fight this, won't you?
Clearly, because we don't believe that this helps us do what we all want to achieve, which is create jobs in Europe. We think this actually is an issue about freedom of choice for the individual, and we also make sure that people are not abused by the current employment legislation we've got, the health and safety legislation we've got, and we think this seriously damages the opportunity to create further jobs in Europe.
Mr Sutcliffe, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'm joined now by the leader of the Labour group of MEPs in the European Parliament who voted to scrap the opt-out, Gary Titley. Mr Titley, how did you get bounced into this?
We didn't get bounced into it. We've been working for 2 or 3 years now on trying to amend a piece of legislation which we felt was badly drafted in the first place, and of course it was drafted during John Major's premiership when the government opted out of negotiations.
So hang on, just to get this clear, you've been working for 2 years to amend a piece of legislation that this government agrees with, your government agrees with.
We are amending the legislation because one of the issues that businesses have been concerned about is that we were calculating these 48-hour week on an average of 17 weeks.
So,
and that is,
so the minister
quite
is
frankly, too inflexible. We've amended it to 52 weeks, which therefore means in many ways, for most people, the opt-out is no longer relevant.
So you know better what is best for the working people of this country than your own government does here?
No, the government wants to have a more flexible legislative arrangement. We have amended this to make it more flexible. They want a better work-life balance. That is what we've been looking at. And thirdly, you've not mentioned it.
They're proposing precisely the reverse of what you've just agreed.
No, we haven't. We have agreed to amend this legislation so a calculation for an average working week is made over 12 months. That therefore deals with the problems of many companies when they have sudden upsurges of work. They are able to deal with those, and we're able to give that average over 12 months.
I'm terribly sorry.
Much more flexible, much more user-friendly.
You know, our audience are intelligent, sophisticated people, Mr. Titley, but you've just told us one statement of affairs, and the Minister has just told us they intend to reverse what you have just agreed in Strasbourg. Who's talking nonsense?
No, the government wants to maintain the opt-out. Our concern was primarily to get this to be more flexible. We've done that. The issue of the opt-out is to be decided by governments, and the British government will be taking its position in the Council of Ministers.
But the Minister has just said,
particularly in relation to health sector,
I mean, the Minister has just said that they intend to preserve the opt-out.
that is what the government's position is going to be.
And your position is something different, although you belong to the same party.
No, our position is not different. Our position is that we need to amend the legislation, make it more flexible, and it's therefore questionable why the opt-out is necessary. There's more than one way of skinning a cat.
Well, indeed, there seem to be an infinite number of ways of skinning a cat. Mr. Titley, thank you very much indeed. We're joined here in the studio now by David Willits, the Conservative spokesman at this newly named Department of what used to be Department of Trade and Industry, it's productivity and whatever it is, employment and something else now.
And yes, and energy.
Energy, yeah. Do you disagree with anything in the government's position, leaving aside the European socialist position, but the government's position, as the government's position, you presumably agree with?
I think the government is right to try to keep the opt-out that John Major secured. And I think, as you brought out, it is extraordinary that we've got all the Labour MEPs in the European Parliament voting against the Labour government. And I should say that the Conservative MEPs in the European Parliament all voted robustly that we should keep the opt-out.
But isn't that itself at odds with what we're told is the new Conservative Party, which is going to be all family friendly?
Well, we also believe that these should be decisions for individuals, and we also think that when it comes to Europe, the dynamism of Europe comes precisely from the diversity of Europe, and the attempt to impose at the level of Brussels a uniform model of employment contracts across Europe is just absolutely the wrong direction in which to go. We don't need to impose uniformity on that. You can still have a competitive internal market without such uniformity. So we believe in national diversity and individual choice.
But you are accepting the basic principle, which seems to stick in the craw of many Europeans, that this gives the British employer and employee a competitive advantage.
Well, I hope that it does give us a competitive advantage. I'd happy if other countries had had a Conservative government negotiating an opt-out like this, then they might be able to enjoy the competitive advantage. This is something that a previous Conservative government negotiated, and I think it's very important that individuals should be able freely to choose. Nobody, of course, is forced to work more than 48 hours. An individual who wishes to do so should be able to do so. And for Europe as a whole, they shouldn't try to impose uniformity at Brussels when there's absolutely no need for it. I think actually historically the reason why Europe over the centuries has been so dynamic is precisely that there is a permanent competition, a permanent contrast of different ways of doing things, and there's no reason to impose one labour market rule across Europe.
So the government has your full support?
Well, the puzzle which you've been pursuing, Jeremy, is why the Labour MEPs in the European Parliament have acted like this. And I think there are only two possibilities. The first possibility is that Blair has actually tipped them the wink, that we've got a classic Blairite exercise where he tells the CBI one thing, that he's battling to keep the opt-out, and meanwhile he's happy to see his Labour MEPs voting the other way. The other possibility, of course, is that Blair's authority is now so weak that he can't get a single Labour MEP to do what he wants.
I mean, I thought you'd said goodbye to all this opportunism, this cheap opposition for the sake of opposition.
If I may say, today...
You can't pretend your party's not divided on Europe.
Today, Conservative MEPs have voted in support of a proposition of successive Conservative and then Labour governments. We have been responsible. We've been thinking about the national interest.
National interest. One of your Conservative MEPs today actually was greatly preoccupied about the precise denomination of feta cheese. Is that a worthwhile pursuit of policy objective?
I wasn't aware of that particular point, and certainly I don't myself think that feta cheese should be a subject on which European parliamentarians devote a large amount of attention.
But yours are.
Well, I don't know about that, but perhaps this is just another example of the absurdities you get into if Europe starts trying to regulate things which should much better be done nationally and locally.
David Willits, thank you very much. Now, it was a private meeting, but by all accounts, at the gathering of the Parliamentary Labour Party, the Prime Minister faced down those on his own back benches who think he's a liability and should step down. Stick by me, he said, and the Labour Party could dominate politics for the next 100 years. The critics who've been saying he's a liability were either ignored or submerged. One minister emerged exclaiming, "Whingers routed." Our political editor, Martha Carney, was stalking the parliamentary corridors this afternoon.
Just the two of us. We can make it if we try.
There are two of them, two Tony Blairs. One who tries to appeal to as many people as possible, the coalition builder, who's learnt lessons from the campaign.
And I've listened and I've learned. And I think I have a very clear idea of what the British people now expect from this government for a third term.
Just the two of us.
The other Tony is presidential, unwilling to compromise, happy when at odds with his own party.
Understand it was a decision this leader had to take for this country. I took that decision.
So which Tony would emerge on the first morning back as Labour MPs arrived back at Westminster? Some new ones knew the ropes, others relied on goodie bags packed with bump.
We have a large pack about stationery. another more general pack, which I haven't actually managed to read yet. Another one on how to use the phone system, which is...
That's a big one.
Yes, it is. And most importantly of all, this wonderful little stress buster, in case it all gets too much.
Labour MPs may need the stress busters, with a much smaller majority and speculation about when their leader's going to stand down. That was the subject of debate at lunchtime, when the party all gathered together in a very crowded committee room to hear the Prime Minister speak. Tony Blair promised a fourth election victory if the party remained united, acknowledged that he'd been too slow to attack the Liberal Democrats, and talked about an orderly transition. But a few MPs wanted that transition sooner rather than later. After the meeting, we spoke to a Blairite, Brownite and a rebel.
I was fortunate to be called to speak in the Parliamentary Labour Party, and I laid it on the line from the Prime Minister that I had not been fighting either the Liberal Democrats or the Conservative Party in Hampstead and Highgate. I had been fighting him.
The Prime Minister was on top of his form. I haven't always agreed with him, but I think he showed that he had the appetite for the third term. He also, I think, showed that hopefully he's going to be as close to Gordon Brown as throughout this term in government as they were when they were eating ice creams together during the general election campaign. And he also promised a smooth transition when it comes.
Tony reminded those who needed reminding that we just won an historic third term. We won it on a clear and very detailed manifesto. And it's all of our jobs to roll out our sleeves and get that manifesto implemented. And I think that was a message that went down very well.
As other Labour MPs like Judy Malabar from Derbyshire settle in for a new term, they want the government to drop some of its old habits. She's rarely rebelled against the leadership, but like many of her colleagues, wants more consultation.
Well, sometimes proposals have come forward without having been fully thought through, and we've then had all the consultation and lots of discussions afterwards, and have often changed them and made them better. So I think we quite like a lot of that consultation to take place before they're announced to the whole world.
Yeah, no, it's just focusing on this issue of fair admissions and spelling out what constitutes fair admissions and what clearly is,
also meeting today in Westminster was the group Comprehensive Future, planning its campaign against new Labour education policy. One of its patrons is Fiona Miller, a former Downing Street advisor. Like some MPs, she's angry about the promotion to minister of another number 10 aide, Andrew Adonis.
I think people felt quite hurt, actually. I mean, I got lots of emails from people who said, I don't know why I bothered to bust the gut getting this government elected last week, only to be kicked in the teeth in this way. However, I do think it presents us with an opportunity, because in the past he's been inside number 10, behind closed doors, as it were, devising policy. Now he'll have to be accountable as a minister.
Another flashpoint for Labour MPs will be welfare reform, in particular government plans to change incapacity benefit.
I think it will be difficult because it's getting the balance right, not saying to people that have got real problems that we're just going to cast you aside, but assisting those people that could get back into work and could maybe have some help to do so.
Another tradition of the first day is to elect the Speaker. Michael Martin's staged reluctance could prove prescient if there's a stormy session ahead. Rebellions could thwart some of Tony Blair's plans, as could the time left to him. So when might the orderly transition take place? A few MPs suggest the end of this year, after a high profile for Tony Blair on the international stage. The EU presidency, which runs from July to December 2005, also the date when Britain's presidency of the G8 ends. Many point to the referendum on the EU constitution, thought to be early in 2006, win or lose. The next big milestone would be to beat Margaret Thatcher's 11 years in office. That would come in May 2008, just a year before a likely election. So what's the betting?
Well, there's a range of odds at the bookies. I'm a betting man. I haven't put my bet on yet, Martha, but when I do, you'll be the first to know.
There's only one man who knows the real odds, but surely any bet would count as insider trading.
Well, with us now is the new Leader of the House of Commons, Geoff Hoon. Michael Howard's told his MPs when he's going to go. Is Tony Blair going to tell his?
I don't believe that we're even discussing that at this stage in a formal sense. There is a process for the Labour Party.
Sometime in this Parliament. Is he going to tell them when?
At some stage, I'm sure he will. But
what do you mean, the week before or a year before?
Well, I think he talked very clearly today about the need for an orderly transition, and that was supported by the overwhelming majority of Labour members of Parliament. It's important, after he has been re-elected, after a Labour government has been re-elected, that we continue our programme of work that we set out in the manifesto.
How much authority does he really have in the House of Commons? I mean, supposing, for example, the ID cards bill comes back, could he get it through?
Yes, he can, and he has the authority that a Prime Minister has with a substantial majority. I would say historically that almost any Prime Minister with this sort of majority would be absolutely delighted.
Oh, come on, look, there were measures last time, tuition fees and the like. He was down to majorities of, 14 and below, in fact. Now the majority is so much smaller, you only need, 38 rebels or something, don't you, to lose?
I think the Prime Minister recognised that when he spoke in Downing Street on Friday, when he said that we would listen more, we would discuss more, we would consult more. Judy Malaber there, a very conscientious, hard-working MP, made it clear that she expects to see a difference of tone and approach by the government, and I'm sure that's right.
What will that difference of tone be?
Well, the Prime Minister made it clear that we would listen more, that we need to involve our members of Parliament more, that there are lessons from those experiences that you rightly and understandably set out that we have to learn if we want to get this programme through. And we are determined to get this new programme of legislation through because it is based on the manifesto that we set out to the British people, upon which we were clearly elected.
So ID cards will definitely come back?
ID cards will definitely come back.
That'll be a commitment in the Queen's speech, will it?
Well, you know that the convention is that I'm not allowed to talk about
and convention. Go on, you can tell us.
Well, I think convention is quite important. It's important that this is set out properly in the Queen's speech. That will be done in due course. You won't have to wait long, Jeremy. The Queen's speech will be next week.
OK, you say the Prime Minister's listening. If he's listening to his MPs, taking on board all their anxieties, what's he doing sending a crony into the House of Lords and the Department of Education?
I think it's important that the Prime Minister, as has always been the case, has the opportunity of choosing his team in government. And Mr Adonis is a very talented, intelligent man. He's enormously knowledgeable about education policy.
But Lord Adonis was put in there by the Prime Minister despite deep reservations having been expressed about his appointment. That's not listening.
But again, it has always been the case that the Prime Minister chooses his team for government.
So he listens except when he doesn't want to listen.
You asked me earlier about the legislative programme and involving members of Parliament. In a sense, partly my job, together with the Chief Whip, to ensure that as we get that programme into Parliament, we do discuss the key elements with colleagues to ensure that we have the kind of support actually that was demonstrated in today's Parliamentary Labour Party meeting.
There are 41 members of your present parliamentary party who were against the war in Iraq. Do you yourself have sufficient authority even to get legislation through?
Yes, I do, and in this sense I'm a member of Parliament. I will vote with the government as indeed the great majority of Labour members of Parliament
with the government.
But that's the point. The authority depends on individual members of Parliament, and they express their views very, very clearly.
One of them
today.
who profoundly disagreed with the decision to go to war, of which you were an intimate part. It only takes 38 rebels to scupper your majority.
But the point of this is that as each individual member of Parliament, each Labour member of Parliament makes up his and her mind on these issues, we obviously have to discuss with them those issues as we go along. That is not to suggest, as you are doing, somehow that simply because a member of Parliament has rebelled in the past, he or she is necessarily going to rebel in the future. That simply is not how it works.
They've got a lot more hold over you there, haven't they?
In a democratic system, they have been elected and they obviously exercise their choice as to how they vote. But again, this came absolutely clearly through the meeting today that they want to see a successful Labour government deliver the programme upon which they and we were elected.
Jeff, thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up on the programme, could George Bush's choice for the UN be facing a humiliating rejection? Before then, though, a roundup of today's news. Our main story tonight, Labour members of the European Parliament have voted to scrap Britain's opt-out from the Working Time Directive that limits British workers to a 48-hour week. The government's new Industry Minister, Jerry Sutcliffe, told Newsnight the government would fight to protect the opt-out at the Council of Ministers meeting in June. Detectives investigating the attempted murder of a woman on a footpath in a Surrey village say they're looking into the movements of a man from the village who died at the end of last month. Abigail Witchells was stabbed in the neck in Little Bookham last month in front of her toddler son. A 23-year-old man who's believed to have driven to Scotland by himself some days after the attack died in hospital after apparently taking a large amount of painkillers. Iraq has suffered one of its bloodiest days in months. A wave of suicide bombings has killed more than 70 people and wounded many others. At least 33 died in Saddam Hussein's hometown of Tikrit when a car bomb exploded in a market. A further 30 people died in Hawjam when a suicide bomber targeted an army recruitment centre. Attacks have escalated since Iraq's new government was unveiled. In western Iraq, American forces are continuing an operation in a bid to stem the flow of militants from across the border with Syria. The Queen and the Prime Minister have attended a service at St Paul's Cathedral to remember the victims of the Indian Ocean tsunami. During a 2-minute silence, petals fell onto the congregation, one for each of the nearly 300,000 people who died on Boxing Day. The film director Lord Attenborough, who lost 3 members of his family in the disaster, read a lesson.
Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. For the first things have passed away. Thanks be to God.
The actor Macaulay Culkin, who made his name as a child star, has appeared as a defense witness in the Michael Jackson trial in California. He described allegations that the singer had molested him as ridiculous. Michael Jackson denies all the charges against him. There was a major security alert at the White House and in the US Congress on Capitol Hill this afternoon. Staff in the building were told to leave and fighter jets scrambled to patrol the skies above Washington. A light aircraft is said to have strayed into restricted airspace without permission, but changed course when it was approached by a fighter plane. The all clear was announced after just a few minutes. And the markets, the FTSE 100 share index was down 17 in New York. The Dow Jones closed up 26 against the euro. The pound fell slightly, and against the dollar the pound was also down. The man George Bush wants to send to the United Nations as America's ambassador will discover tomorrow whether the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is prepared to endorse his posting. He's so controversial that the government has had to turn over thousands of documents, and the committee's interviewed scores of witnesses to find whether John Bolton, the man the North Koreans have called human scum, is fit for the job. Peter Marshall is in Washington investigating.
When it comes to John Bolton, people react. His critics have been lining up to say he's a bully and a bit of a creep.
He's a quintessential kiss up, kick down sort of guy.
Even his defenders acknowledge he's robust.
He's not a striped pants diplomat. He's not a man with a glass of wine in his hand and a piece of brie in the other. He's hard charging, he's got a lot of conviction, and he doesn't sugarcoat things.
Now George Bush wants the sugar-free Bolton to be his man at the UN. It's an interesting choice.
It's hard for me to know why you'd want to work at an institution that you said didn't even exist. You said it doesn't even exist.
Over the past month, John Bolton's trenchant views have returned to haunt his nomination as UN ambassador. Under the normal scheme, he'd have been approved weeks ago, but this isn't normal. Over John Bolton, people take sides.
Some have said that sending you to New York would be like sending Nixon to China. I'm concerned it'll be more like sending a bull into a china shop.
In Senate hearings, the spotlight's been turned on Bolton's antipathy to the UN and his commitment to conservative ideology. For Bolton, said to be even more of a Bushite than George Bush himself.
I look forward to working closely with this committee to forge a stronger relationship between the United States and the United Nations, which depends critically on American leadership.
John Bolton's George Bush's approach to international affairs made flesh. He's aggressive, combative, some say provocative. And yet, this man with an habitual disdain for the niceties of diplomacy is hoping to become America's senior diplomat. Everywhere from Korea and Cuba to Iraq and Iran, he's accused of twisting intelligence, behaving autocratically, and bullying those who've stood in his way. And so we have President Bush vowing to build bridges and make friends with the international community, choosing as his candidate a man who's acquired an extraordinary number of enemies.
You can't steal Florida!
John Bolton first came to prominence 5 years ago during the post-election wrangling in Florida. He'd earlier declared, "I'm with Bush Cheney and I'm here to stop the count."
I'm just saying, I'm not going back through 18,000 ballots, and if you guys want to do it, I will authorize you to do it.
Having planted the flag for Bush, he moved to America's Foreign Office, the State Department, and advanced on the wider world. One of the significant issues into which John Bolton marched was North Korea's nuclear program. It was the summer of 2003, the Koreans were being coaxed into talks, the situation was delicate.
Mr. Bolton scheduled a trip to Seoul to be in Seoul on the 31st of July to deliver a speech. It was clearly, in my mind, counter to what the president's environment was trying to be, what the president was trying to establish in creating six-party talks, bringing people together to talk.
What was wrong with Bolton's speech?
The speech itself disparaged the leader of North Korea some 43 times.
His Senate opponents say this Bolton style will be ill-suited to the UN.
It strikes me that things haven't gotten better with respect to North Korea and Iran. You say that this particular speech or approach was helpful. I'm trying to figure out in what sense was it helpful?
At the conservative think tank, the AEI, where John Bolton developed his worldview, they say the Bolton approach is exactly what the UN needs.
Mr. Bolton's language is not diplomatic. That's absolutely true.
But he's supposed to be America's leading diplomat. That's the idea he's going to be.
No. Again, diplomatic language is not always called for. Sometimes it is necessary to be straightforward. Diplomacy is not about making the world safe for cocktail parties. It is about furthering the interests of the United States as dictated by the elected President of the United States, period.
On North Korea, America's envoy didn't see it like that.
I thought it was gratuitous, unuseful, unhelpful. I saw no merit in it, and it certainly didn't help the cause of the President of the United States at the time. People had to do repair work to make sure that the talks took place.
Were you surprised that John Bolton did that?
I was surprised that he got away with it, not surprised that he tried to do it.
Another John Bolton speech, this time over Syria's weapons program, again alarmed officials who say he exaggerated the evidence. Robert Hutchings was in charge of the National Intelligence Council.
It was taking small fragments of evidence and making a case, a preconceived case that went well beyond what I felt and others felt was a legitimate interpretation of the facts. And this after we'd already had the experience of going into Iraq and finding that the weapons of mass destruction we felt were there were not.
So you're saying his instinct ought to have been caution at that point?
Exactly. I mean, the drafts that I saw were, I would say, irresponsible under any circumstances. They were almost unbelievable in the context of the WMD experience.
If he gets to the UN, John Bolton will have to live down this reputation for crying wolf and for berating analysts whose findings don't coincide with his views.
This effort has an effect not so much on people at my level, we are able to defend ourselves, but on younger analysts. They're the ones I worry about, operating in an environment in which there's an obvious correct answer to intelligence questions and an obvious answer that gets you in trouble.
You say get you in trouble, how do you mean?
There's a climate of intimidation.
I think that's absolute rubbish. We have a culture that has come up in the last few years in which you are not allowed to question intelligence analysts. Now, if we're not allowed to question intelligence analysts, we're going to end up with a lot of lousy intelligence. And, we have ended up with a lot of lousy intelligence.
All right, I'm just trying to understand.
In the Senate, though, they've heard that Mr. Bolton's demeanour was often closer to inquisition than inquiry.
Unfortunately, my judgment, my opinion, he's a quintessential kiss up, kick down sort of guy. There are a lot of them around. I'm sure you've met them. But the fact is that he stands out, that he's got a bigger kick, and it gets bigger and stronger the further down the bureaucracy he's kicking.
It is deeply disturbing to me in the environment we're in, where it is so important for those of us who sit on this side of the table, for those of you who sit on the side of the table you're on, that we have factual information coming from our intelligence community. And if at any point we begin to suspect that that information is being tailored to serve what Senator Lugar talked about this morning, a personal point of view, then I think it's dangerous.
Behind the scenes, Colin Powell, who was John Bolton's boss when Secretary of State, has been briefing senators that he too was concerned by the bullying style. He will also have been perturbed by revelations that John Bolton again apparently overreached his status in requesting the details of phone intercepts from the National Security Agency. Now, there's great speculation here about what John Bolton was up to. with many believing he was digging for dirt on Colin Powell himself, or on others he deemed soft on foreign policy. The truth's likely to remain buried by national security. But what is clear is that Colin Powell represents a strain of Republican Party opinion deeply opposed to John Bolton going to the UN.
There are people in the Republican Party who don't like the politics that John embraces, don't like the politics the President embraces. That's their right.
Colin Powell wasn't happy with him, was he?
Well, he seems to have made that clear.
What do you think of that?
I think it's a shame that the former Secretary of State has chosen to criticize John behind the scenes. I don't think it was the most honorable thing to do, and I'm not quite sure what his objections were, but I'd certainly like to hear them out loud rather than whispered from others.
Are you sick and tired of politicians who blame their own country for all the world's problems? We need leaders who will stand up for American values, like John Bolton. That's the man President Bush has nominated to fight for America as our next United Nations ambassador. But
tonight, with John Bolton's nomination in the balance, both sides have taken TV ads in key states to sway wavering senators.
We need a strong and effective United Nations. So why did the president nominate John Bolton to be our UN ambassador?
There is no such thing as the United Nations.
Bolton wants to dismantle the UN, not reform it.
The Secretariat building in New York has 38 stories. If you lost 10 stories today, it would make a bit of difference.
Amid this furore, President Bush, who says he wants to shake up the UN, now looks entrenched in his support for John Bolton.
John Bolton's a blunt guy. Sometimes people say I'm a little too blunt. John Bolton can get the job done at the United Nations.
It's close, but the likelihood is that John Bolton will eventually become America's ambassador to the UN. The world's diplomats will be holding their breath.
Peter Marshall. Now she's been called Osama bin Laden's worst nightmare, a feminist scholar who also happens to be a practicing Muslim. Irshad Manji believes that Islam needs to be rescued from the fundamentalists who used it to justify terrorism, slavery and the oppression of women. Her book, The Trouble with Islam, is a manifesto for an open-minded, non-dogmatic approach to her religion, which she believes is the only way to ensure its relevance in the modern world. Here are just a few of her thoughts.
There's no bigger idea for the Muslim world today, and consequently for all of us, than reopening the gates of independent thinking, or ijtihad. Through our screaming self-pity and our conspicuous silences, we Muslims are conspiring against ourselves. We're in crisis and we're dragging the rest of the world with us. If ever there was a moment for an Islamic reformation, it's now. When abuse happens under the banner of my religion, most Muslims, including us moderates, have no clue how to debate, dissent, revise or reform. Because of the debates that have emerged out of 9/11, those of us who have been working for years for the liberal reformation of Islam, we finally have a voice that's being heard outside our communities. Since neither Israel nor America lies at the root of Muslim misery worldwide, is it Islam that does? As I view it, the trouble with Islam is that lives are small and lies are big. Totalitarian impulses lurk in mainstream Islam. That's one hell of a charge, I know, but please hear me out.
Well, Irshad Manji is with us now. Are you embarrassed by your religion?
Am I embarrassed by it? No. If I was, I would have left the faith. I am saddened and disappointed that more of my fellow Muslims don't have the faith in themselves to be more thoughtful and more humane than most of our clerics give us credit for.
Why, in your judgment, hasn't there been a reformation in Islam?
There are plenty of reasons, Jeremy, but the major one, as I've argued in my book, is that although Islam once exuded a glorious tradition of independent thinking, known as ijtihad, in that setup piece we heard about it, the gates of ijtihad closed for entirely political reasons hundreds of years ago. And what happened at that time was that innovation was trumped by imitation. In fact, innovation was deemed a crime. This is not a healthy way to build a future. And here's the thing, Jeremy.
You could argue something similar happened in the Christian church pre the Reformation.
But moderate Christians and even moderate Jews are able to see their holy books as parables, as metaphors. In Islam today, literalism has gone mainstream, and what that means is that even moderate Muslims accept as an article of faith that the Quran is not like any other holy book. It is God 3.0, and that's a supremacy complex.
You're arguing then, are you, that the Quran is metaphor, parable, what?
I'm arguing that we should be open to publicly debating and discussing the possibility that the Quran is as much a historical document as the other sacred books are. And here's the key, Jeremy, without fear for our lives. That is also what differentiates Islam today from Christianity and Judaism.
Well,
we have not yet had our liberal reformation in that sense.
Sure, you're arguing it's somewhere in the position that much Christianity was, what, in the middle of the 16th century?
Well, actually...
people then were burned at the stake for their...
Sure.
For heresy.
Absolutely.
And
by the way, by writing a book entitled The Trouble with Islam, I am not for a moment arguing that Christianity is problem-free or Judaism is problem-free. I'm saying that we Muslims have a lot of catching up to do in the dissent department.
But do you worry that in publishing this sort of book, you perhaps incite, encourage anti-Muslim feeling?
Sure I worry about it. I would have to worry about it as a person of conscience. But I can also tell you that for the 300 plus daily emails that I get, I can count on one hand the number who have said to me, "Thank you for reinforcing my racism." Infinitely more non-Muslims have said to me, "Thank you for showing that in Islam, you are capable of thinking in an open-minded, liberal way and still remain faithful." And I just need to say one other thing. When I say faithful, Jeremy, it's also important for all of our viewers to realize that the Quran actually invites us to openly dissent with abuses that are happening in the name of Allah. There's a very important passage that says, "Believers, conduct yourselves with justice and bear true witness before God, even if it be against yourselves, your parents, or your family." That includes my religious family, and I am a serious enough Muslim to take that passage seriously.
How exposed do you feel? I mean, are there many people who are on your side, as it were, in arguing for a reformation?
Yes, there are many people, particularly of the emerging generation. I can't begin to tell you how many young Muslims, both in the West and beyond the West, in the Middle East in particular, have expressed their support, their affection, even their love for ideas like this. The problem is that most of them still say they can't go public with that support, that they can't even be vocal about their own struggles with the faith today because they fear, and I'm going to cite a word that is used with me constantly, persecution. Now, I'm a journalist. I don't assume what they mean by persecution. I ask them. And time and again, the answer comes back: physical violence against ourselves, sometimes from our families, sometimes from our fellow Muslims against ourselves and our families. And this is in relatively open societies like Britain, US, Canada, Australia, not just the relatively closed societies of the Middle East. That's why I and a group of young Muslims have launched Project Ijtihad, which is a foundation, a leadership center to encourage young Muslims to step up to the plate and dissent openly with authoritarianism.
Irshad Manji, thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
And let's have a quick look at some of tomorrow morning's front pages. News that the suspect in the Abigail Witchell's murder case has apparently committed suicide. The Financial Times, the European MP's embarrassment. The Daily Telegraph goes for the same story. The Times has news that interest rates may be cut because of the slump in high street sales. Well, that's all from Newsnight tonight. There is round-the-clock news coverage on BBC News 24. Gavin will be back with more tomorrow. We leave you tonight with scenes from today's memorial service for the victims of the Asian tsunami.
Imagine a world without signs, symbols, or even pictures.
This is the extraordinary story of how we humans discovered the power of images.
See how our ancestors created the way our world looks today. How Art Made the World, Monday at 9 on BBC Two.
Welcome to BBC 4 on BBC 2. The tiny island of Tuvalu could be the first in the world to succumb to global warming. So now Storyville discovers what the islanders are doing to keep afloat.
Tuvalu is one of the world's smallest nations, just a speck on the map in the middle of the South Pacific. I went there and I wondered, how do you feel when you're about to lose the land beneath your feet?
Those who don't know where is Tuvalu, how big is Tuvalu, what type of people are the Tuvaluans, I'm sure they don't care about us. But those people in countries who have had some connections with Tuvalu, I'm sure they worry and they do care about us and our future.
This is a story of 10,000 people who live only 3 meters above sea level. At first they didn't think that the sea was anything to worry about.
Before August last year, I sort of never believed, that we can actually sink. But on that day, just one wave just came through right in broad daylight like this. This car had to go through about 3 feet of water. And it was quite terrifying, And when I saw that wave, coming on the land, and it was low tide, it sort of clicked to me that I think, we're going to sink one day. Just when, we don't know yet.
The survival of this tiny island is now being played out on a world stage.
We are the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable countries. I need not remind the conference that the whole issue of climate change to us is not economics and politics, but is of life and death.
This is our way of life. It's not an organized game. They just enjoy the afternoon.
You're listening to the BBC World Service. US lawmakers, Republican and Democrat, are increasingly critical of the...
I listen to the radio most of the time. I'm very interested in listening to what is happening in the other side of the world. It's so different from from this part of the world. I always say to my husband, we thank God we are so peaceful out here. The BBC World News, there are a lot of problems causing on the other side of the world. Sad, eh? We are ready to go.
Could you imagine living anywhere else, Lisa?
It's very hard because we are used to our own way of life here. But I would try if it is a must that I have to be moved from here, then I will just have to try it. It's very sad that the land is not very big and now it's being washed away bit by the sea. I don't believe it's natural erosion. See, these ones are all going to go down. I'm sure in 5 years' time, they will all be down and the beach will move up and move in. When I was a kid, I never heard of, there are places in the sea where you just go and collect the fish, that the fish were just sort of swimming about because of the heat. No, when I was a girl, no. But a few years ago, this always happens. Maybe 2 days when it's really hot. The children and even the adults used to come and collect fish. That particular part of the sea, the fish are just swimming around, going to die because of so much heat. But before, we don't usually have that.
But no more trees.
No more tree.
What happened?
There was a cyclone that hit the island and everything got washed away by the storm.
If the tide is
keeps coming up
the way that they are predicting, it will not take that many years before there are no soil, only the sand on top of the coral, and it's the water on top of the coral will get so salty. So then the trees, they will not be washed away, but they will start to die. Because they're too salty.
Yeah.
That will be the first sign that that it's really getting too high.
Terry is a Norwegian writer. He's doing just about everything he can to tell the world about the dangers of global warming. He met and married Emma, a Tuvaluan, 16 years ago.
Hei sann, ja. Hei.
Så må vi få litt mat da, vet du.
Ja, det må vi ha.
Hva gir mat?
Dette er innfødt. Jeg vil advare dere hvis det er noe fetende her, så ikke vis det frem, så ikke Rode ser det.
Det er sånne brød som er sånn rundt sånn, og så masse sånne kuler på. Det er sånn du lager, Emma? Ja. Har du lyst på pizza? Du har på McDonald's, du da, kanskje din skur. Hæ? Oi, McDonald's. Oi.
A lot of erosion occur around there.
50 centimeters is not much to people in other countries, but for people living in Tuvalu, 50 centimeters is quite a lot at high tide.
Yeah.
And you cannot climb up in the mountain.
There's no other highland.
No mountain here. Okay, papatai. Lotta. This is the best drink if you're hot and tired and thirsty. That's the one you need. That is #1 drink.
Så det er en coke?
Better than Coke and other stuff. It's been washed away on this side too, no?
Yeah.
I was very surprised to see all the trees just
erosions.
Yeah, erosion just washed away, huh? Yes. We're gonna cross through here. Oi! Bottles, plastics, old shoes. Yes. Are you afraid sometimes? What
Yeah.
Yeah?
Probably I've been thinking of migrating.
You're thinking about migrating? So where you want to go? To New Zealand?
Probably New Zealand.
Yeah. You've got some family down there already?
Yeah.
So how long then do you think before you're leaving
Probably
Tuvalu?
another 2 years.
Another 2 years? And you think that's about it?
Yeah.
It's a pity, no? You think finally the sea will take away everything, or?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Probably, yeah.
Oh, I'm just doing the replanting of my Pulaka pit here. It's being damaged by the sea, so we'll have to replant it. Pulaka is very, very susceptible to seawater. Once you touch it, and they all turn red like this. And when they turn red, the root is rotten and it's gone.
Why have people stopped growing it?
Consider that if they have the money, they can buy the rice from the shop, or simply they are lazy to do the hard work. They want the easier work.
Why is Pulaka important?
Well, this is the only root crops that you are known as, a real Tuvaluan. People used to plant it as status, prestige, and for their families. And has been from generation after generations. What a pity that if you allow the grass to grow over, you have nothing there. So it's better to work on it and keep going.
Do you think your grandson will still be planting Pulaka in 40 years?
That I doubt.
Other people, they don't worry because they said, why are you worrying about that? God has said in the Bible, the rainbow is the sign of my love, and I won't send any more flood that will kill the whole world. But if you think about God just to be kind and be generous to the people of Tuvalu so that we don't die and disappear, what about the other parts of the world? That we heard from the BBC World News that thousands of people perish in one go. So why do we have to believe and say God will just look after the people of Tuvalu? We don't want to disappear. No, I think we have to do something.
Whatever they did, it would be a David and Goliath struggle. I noticed that some senior politicians on the island were talking tough.
We are on the front line of climate change, through no fault of our own. And it is only fair that people or industrialized nations and industries take responsibility for the actions that they are posing. It's like the polluter pays principle. You pollute, you pay. This is a very drastic action, and it shows the seriousness in which we take this threat to our future well-being.
What do you know about the United Nations proposed climate treaty?
Isn't that about global warming?